Welcome back. This is part 5 of our continuing series about the exegesis put forward by Kierkegaard Skelly and those that were refuting Calvinism concerning the refutation of the doctrine of original sin in Romans 5:12. In part 4, we continued our survey of possible objections to the orthodox exegesis of Romans 5:12. We discussed the true nature of the tree of life and how God really does consider others culpable and guilty of another sin. Now, what we would like to do in this part of our video series is to continue with another citation from the New Testament showing the continuity of this principle to the New Covenant period. Our next example comes from Matthew 23 and 35, where the generation that lived at the time of Jesus would be considered guilty of all the blood of the prophets. Now, Jesus in Matthew 23 had been in the process of severely denouncing the scribes and Pharisees for their gross hypocrisies. At the end of this denunciation, Jesus notes how they themselves have admitted that they are the sons of those who murdered the prophets, thus testifying against themselves. Verse 31. Now notice the anti-modern day preaching Jesus did in verse 32 through verse 33. And you, it says in the original text, you fill up the measure of your fathers. Snakes, offspring of snakes, how may you run from the judgment of Gehenna? He actually encourages his opponents for them to kill him and invokes the very principle having been shown before this video from the passages in Exodus. They did not become snakes, but were the very brood of snakes, sinners naturally, and deserving of punishment by nature. Their fathers' sins had dire consequences way beyond their own selves. Now, perhaps the most telling comments come in verse 34 through verse 36, where Jesus said, "For this reason, behold, I am sending to you prophets and wise men and scribes. From them you will kill and you will crucify, and from them you will beat with a whip in your synagogues, and you will persecute from a city to a city, in order that it may come on you every righteous blood being continually poured out on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel as far as the blood of Zacharias son of Berechiah, whom you killed between the temple and the altar. Amen, I say to you, it will come all these things on this generation." Now focus especially on verse 35. These scribes and Pharisees will be held personally responsible for the murders of every righteous person listed in the Tanakh from Genesis to the Chronicles, the original order of the Old Testament. Specifically, Jesus himself said that these scribes and Pharisees had murdered Zechariah. Now, they had not personally done so, but their fathers had. Their fathers' sin did not just affect themselves. According to Jesus and his interpretation of the law, their descendants, by the very consequences of sin itself, became guilty in the sight of God of their father's evil act. It was for this reason they could be punished justly for all these sins. Jesus did not hold to the position advocated by Mr. Skelly, Jesse Morrell, Open Air Preacher, or anyone else at refuting Calvinism. Now, in conclusion, after carefully examining many of the common objections to the exegesis of the phrase in Romans 5:12, through sin, death, it is the only exegesis of the text, which I've offered here, that remains faithful to the Old Testament definition of death, which encompasses both the physical and spiritual realms, and maintains the complete and full consequences of a man's sin on his progeny. Now we can move on to the next phrase in Romans 5:12 that we have yet to examine, where it says, "Also in the same manner death spread to all men, on the basis of which that all sinned." Now, Mr. Skelly claims that the focus of this verse is that Adam's sin is influencing every person who has reached the age of accountability to sin. And it is each accountable person's first sin that triggers this death, this spiritual death. Now, there are several problems with this exegesis. Firstly, this interpretation takes the blame for this death off of Adam and places it on his descendants. The focus of the entire passage is clearly that what Adam did had an effect, and was discussed earlier. See verse 12. Death was actually brought into the world. Adam did not bring in the mere possibility or an influence of it. Also, this affected his descendants, referred to the previous discussion we just did, of the biblical nature of death. And the whole context also shows that what Jesus, the new Adam, did actually had an effect, not an influence. See verse 18 and 19. Now, this text does not in any way support the theory of those at refuting Calvinism. Let's examine why. Let's dig into the grammar. First off, first part of the phrase here, death spread. Both the English and the Greek term here are terms indicating past tense. For example, the Greek term here is dielphon, coming from dierchomai. Now, go search Bauer, Art, and Gingrich, where they specifically cite this exact usage on page 193 as a term that means death came to all men. This Greek term is in the aorist tense, indicating an action that was done in the past with no comments as to aspect. Now, it can be punctiliar, happening at one point in time, if the context requires it. And in this case, it clearly does. For Mr. Skelly to be correct, the text would have to read, in the same manner, death is spreading to all men. In Paul's mind, this death happened at one point in the past and is not ongoing. So he's simply in error on this point. Now, moving on to the phrase all men. The term here we find here is anthropos, coming from anthropos. Does this word imply only all uncountable people, as Mr. Skelly asserts? Well, there are several problems with this interpretation. Now, let's assume for a moment that the term actually means this. If this were the case, then the statement, as we determined before from exegesis, would have to mean that death has spread to all accountable people at the time of Paul's writing, and would then have no more force or application to anyone else 1 second after Paul penned his words. Whole host of accountable people could never be properly addressed from this passage from that point on. Adam could not be blamed for the supposed influence of sin and death he has on every human being that has ever lived. The text again would have to show some sort of ongoing action for even this interpretation of all men to have any ground. Now, the restriction of this Greek term to only mean all accountable people is without any scholarly basis, and is simply stated without giving a single lexical source. Mr. Skelly only likes to do this when he wants to prove selected points to get some sort of edge over his opponents to win an argument, which is surely not the work of a dedicated Bible scholar or an exegete. So what we're going to do in this next video is to examine what does Bauer, Art, and Gingrich have to say concerning the term here, dierchomai. Join us next time for this continuing examination of Romans 5:12.